Dog saves owner from danger. What happens next will make you believe in miracles. The wind howled through the trees as the thick fog rolled in, covering the forest floor in a blanket of white mist. The night was dark, and the usual sounds of wildlife were eerily absent, as if nature itself had paused to witness something extraordinary. On the outskirts of this forest, a desolate road wound through the woods, its asphalt cracked and weathered, rarely traveled. In the distance, the faint sound of crunching tires against gravel could be heard, followed by the screech of metal as a car veered off the road. The car spun violently, crashing into a nearby tree with a deafening thud. The once pristine vehicle now lay in ruins, its twisted frame caught in the embrace of the ancient oak. Inside, a young woman hung motionless in the driver's seat, blood staining her clothes, her face frozen in a grimace of pain. But amidst the chaos of the accident, there was something else. A soft cry, barely audible over the wind, cut through the stillness. It was the faintest sound, a baby's cry, shaking through the dark, desperate and helpless. The baby's tiny voice trembled in the night air, reaching out for help. The sound, filled with fear and longing, seemed to linger in the fog. Out of the mist, a figure appeared, a massive, hulking shape moving toward the wreckage. It was a dog, its thick, shaggy fur blending into the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. At first, it was unclear whether the dog would be a threat to the child, or if it even knew what it was hearing. But as the creature moved closer, it became clear that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The dog paused at the wreck, its large, powerful body crouched in the fog. The baby's cries grew louder, and the dog, seemingly drawn to the sound, approached the wreckage with a curious yet cautious step. Its sharp claws scraped across the ground as it carefully circled the car, eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Then, in a moment of rare compassion, the dog did something no one would have expected. It reached through the broken car window, its large paws gently nudging the baby. The infant, its eyes wide with terror, reached out to the dog, recognizing in the beast a savior in the dark. With surprising tenderness, the dog carefully lifted the baby, its massive claws gently cradling the fragile form. In that moment, the world seemed to stand still, suspended in time as the dog, usually feared for its strength and ferocity, revealed a side that few could have imagined, a side that would change everything. This was not just a simple rescue, it was a bond, a moment of connection between two beings from different worlds, linked by an unspoken understanding. And what happened next would defy all expectations and leave everyone who heard the story questioning the very nature of compassion, kindness, and the mysteries of the wild. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind this extraordinary act of rescue, one that would shake the very foundation of what we know about animals and the capacity for kindness. The wind howled once more, swirling around the wreckage, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the distant echoes of an ancient forest that had long borne witness to the passing of time. The dog, now fully at the scene, stood still for a moment, its enormous frame casting an imposing shadow on the shattered remains of the car. The fog thickened, swallowing the space around them, creating an atmosphere of eerie silence. The only sound that broke the stillness was the soft, ragged cry of a baby, a fragile, desperate sound that echoed into the dark, almost pleading. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, its keen senses alert to every shift in the environment. It sniffed the air, its dark eyes narrowing. Something was different, there was something not right. The scent of blood filled the air, the unmistakable scent of the car's twisted metal and the human who lay unconscious in the driver's seat. But underneath it all, buried deep beneath the wreck, was the faint scent of something far more delicate, something that tugged at the dog's instincts. The dog's powerful, muscled body remained still, poised as it processed the situation. Despite the confusion and chaos, there was an undeniable pull, an instinctual force that pushed the creature forward. Its gaze, typically fierce and unyielding, softened for a moment as it focused on the small, terrified cry. The sound was weak, trembling, each note soaked in fear. The infant's cries resonated through the dog's senses, pulling it into action with an urgency it had never known before. Stepping cautiously toward the wreck, the dog's movements were careful, deliberate. Each footfall was calculated, as if the animal could sense the fragility of the situation. The wreckage was a tangle of twisted metal and broken glass, sharp edges gleaming ominously in the foggy moonlight. The dog, though massive and powerful, navigated through it with an unexpected grace, moving closer to the car. It sniffed at the air again, the scent of the baby growing stronger. Peering through the shattered windows, the dog's sharp eyes locked onto the source of the cries. An infant, no more than a few months old, lying amidst the wreckage. Its tiny face was scrunched in terror, its mouth open in distress, its little body trembling in the cold night air. The baby's cries were a lifeline in the otherwise silent night, an echo of hope amidst the chaos. The dog paused, its large, dark eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of threat. There was no sign of movement from the driver. The woman, unconscious and lifeless, remained unresponsive, leaving the infant entirely at the mercy of the animal. But as the dog looked at the child, there was no trace of aggression in its gaze, no signs of hunger or malice. Instead, there was a rare softness, a tenderness that seemed out of place for such a ferocious creature. The dog moved closer to the car, its massive paws carefully maneuvering around the twisted metal, avoiding the shards of glass that littered the ground. It leaned in closer, its large nose inhaling deeply as it sniffed the baby. The child's fragile form trembled at the touch of the dog's cold, wet nose, but there was no fear, only a quiet, innocent trust. The dog paused for a moment, observing the baby with an almost human-like curiosity. It was clear the animal was unsure of what to do next. Was it meant to harm? Or was this a situation where it could do something? Something different? The baby's cries grew fainter, its energy draining with every breath, but its small hands reached out, instinctively reaching for warmth, for safety, for something to hold on to. It was a gesture that no one could ignore. The dog, still uncertain of its next move, took a step back, but as the baby cried again, this time with a more desperate, pleading tone, the dog's instincts took over. With a gentleness that would have stunned anyone who had ever witnessed its power in the wild, the dog carefully reached inside the wreckage. Its enormous claws, usually capable of shredding through thick wood and flesh, were soft and controlled as it gently nudged the baby closer to the edge of the car. The infant's tiny body was trembling, but the dog's movements were calculated and protective, as if it understood the delicate nature of the situation. There was no haste in its actions, just a slow, steady rhythm of care. It took the baby, its massive paw wrapping around the infant with surprising tenderness, its claws gripping just enough to keep the child secure. The dog's mouth opened, and instead of biting or mauling, it lifted the baby, cradling it against its warm, thick fur. The baby's cries quieted as the warmth of the dog's body enveloped it, offering some comfort in the midst of the terrifying situation. As the dog took the baby into its arms, the forest around them seemed to pause. The fog swirled, creating an almost magical atmosphere, as if nature itself had halted to witness this moment. The dog, once a symbol of untamed power, was now carrying the infant with the utmost care, its actions speaking louder than words ever could. With the baby safe in its grasp, the dog turned away from the wreckage. The sounds of the crash and the woman's fading breath became distant, replaced by the rhythmic sounds of the dog's footsteps on the forest floor. The fog parted slightly, as though guiding the way forward, and the creature, with its precious cargo, began its journey into the unknown depths of the forest. The discovery of the baby, lying alone in the wreckage, was only the beginning of an extraordinary tale. A tale that would challenge everything we think we know about the kindness of animals, and the capacity for compassion in even the most unlikely of creatures. The forest was dark, its depths unknown, but the dog seemed unperturbed. It moved forward with purpose, its steps sure as it carried the baby, one step closer to an unexpected rescue that would alter the course of the infant's life and its own. The adventure had just begun. The forest loomed before them, dark and dense, its towering trees stretching high into the sky like silent sentinels. The dog, with the infant cradled gently in its massive paws, ventured deeper into the woods, its powerful legs pushing through the underbrush with ease. The ground beneath its feet was soft, covered in a layer of moss and fallen leaves that muffled the sound of its movements. The fog that had once clung to the wreckage now hung like a ghostly veil between the trees, casting everything in an ethereal glow. As the dog moved deeper into the wilderness, the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. The baby's tiny form was secure against the dog's warm, shaggy fur, its cries now reduced to the occasional whimper. The infant, though exhausted and hungry, seemed to find some solace in the dog's rhythmic movements, as if the creature's steady pace was a lullaby of sorts. There was no sign of fear in the baby now, only the gentle reassurance that, for the moment, it was safe. The dog continued its trek, following a well-worn path through the trees. There was an undeniable sense of purpose in its steps, a quiet determination that seemed to guide it with unerring accuracy. It knew this forest. It had lived here for years, learned its hidden paths, and understood its dangers. But this was different. The creature's protective instincts were heightened, and every step it took seemed more calculated, as if the weight of the baby in its care had made the forest itself feel more alive, more pressing, more urgent. As they ventured further, the dog's mind remained focused, but its sharp eyes scanned the surroundings for any sign of danger. The deeper into the forest they went, the more primitive the environment became. The path grew steeper, the trees thicker, and the underbrush more entangled. Yet the dog moved with grace, as though it had become one with the forest, its massive body slipping through the thick foliage without leaving a trace of its passage. The baby, exhausted from the journey, was drifting in and out of consciousness, its small body limp in the dog's grasp. The dog's pace slowed as it reached a small clearing. The thick canopy above allowed only dappled light to filter through, illuminating the soft green of the moss-covered ground. The dog paused for a moment, its keen senses alert to any signs of nearby predators. It sniffed the air, checking for the scent of other animals. But the only scent that mattered now was that of the baby, fragile and vulnerable, nestled in its arms. The dog settled down on the soft earth, its large form sinking into the moss, as it carefully placed the baby in its lap. The infant stirred but did not wake fully, still caught in the heavy fog of exhaustion. The dog's sharp eyes softened as it surveyed its surroundings. It had found a temporary refuge, a safe place to rest, to gather strength. The dog gently cradled the child, its powerful paws acting as a barrier against the harsh wilderness that surrounded them. A soft growl rumbled in the dog's throat as it scanned the clearing. It was not one of threat, but of caution, protecting what it now held so dear. The dog's instincts kicked into overdrive. It had always been a solitary creature, self-sufficient and indifferent to the needs of others. But something had changed. The baby had become part of its world, and with that, the dog's protective instincts flared. With a sense of urgency, the dog moved to find food for the child. Its nose twitched, and it set off toward a nearby stream, following the scent of fresh water. The forest was alive, teeming with life, but there was a specific urgency to the way the dog moved now. The baby needed sustenance, something to bring it back from the brink of exhaustion. The dog's journey was no longer one of survival for itself alone. It was now carrying the weight of responsibility. At the stream, the dog dipped its large paws into the cool, clear water, stirring up the soft ripples. It drank deeply, its powerful jaws parting as it gulped down the water with a thirst that seemed unquenchable. Then, after a moment of hesitation, the dog moved along the bank and began foraging. It wasn't an animal that typically relied on plants, but it had learned over time that survival meant adaptability. With its claws, the dog pulled up wild roots and leafy greens, things that it had never cared for before, but now seemed vital. The dog returned to the clearing, its claws full of gathered food, and gently placed the plants near the baby. The infant, still too weak to grasp the food, lay there, motionless but breathing steadily. The dog leaned in, nudging the baby softly with its nose, as if urging it to eat. But the baby, too weak and too tired, could not respond. The dog, sensing the urgency in the air, turned to the next course of action. It had seen creatures care for their young before, and though the baby was not its own, the dog understood the universal need to nurture. It began to move in circles around the infant, its movements slow and deliberate. Then, with a surprising tenderness, it began to create a small shelter around the baby. Using its claws and large paws, the dog pushed aside leaves and branches, creating a small nest of sorts. It was a crude shelter, but to the baby it was a symbol of safety. As the dog worked, it continued to growl softly, a steady hum of protection. The sounds of the forest, the calls of distant birds, the rustling of smaller animals, seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the dog's focus. There was no sense of time here. All that mattered was the baby, now carefully cradled in a safe space, surrounded by the dog's protective presence. Night fell slowly, casting a deep shadow over the clearing. The temperature dropped, and the baby's tiny form shivered in the cool air. Without hesitation, the dog moved again, using its thick fur to shield the baby from the chill. The dog's body was warm, comforting, and the baby, despite being in a strange and terrifying new world, seemed to relax in the presence of the wild creature. Hours passed, and the dog remained vigilant. It never slept, always watching over the baby as if it were its own cub. The connection between them was unspoken, but undeniable. A bond forged not by blood, but by the shared understanding of vulnerability and the instinct to protect. The forest, once dark and ominous, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a refuge from the dangers of the world outside. The dog's journey had turned into a mission of mercy. It had set aside its own needs to focus on the fragile life it had found. And in doing so, the dog's primal instincts had transcended survival. It had become a protector, a guardian, and, in its own way, a parent. The baby, slowly recovering from the shock, lay nestled in the warmth of the dog's embrace. The forest around them was silent once again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The night would stretch on, but the dog would never stray far. It had found something it had never expected to find, a purpose in this moment of fragile life, and no force in the world could make it abandon that purpose now. The air in the forest was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as the day broke, the first light of dawn creeping through the dense canopy above. The fog, though it lingered in the lowlands, had started to lift, revealing a landscape both beautiful and wild. The baby, nestled against the dog's warm, protective body, stirred slightly in its makeshift shelter. Its tiny hands, still too weak to move with any force, rested in the softness of the dog's fur, and though it had not yet fully awakened, its breathing was steady. For the dog, the world beyond this little patch of the forest was a distant concern. Its powerful senses were constantly alert to the sounds around it. Every rustle in the trees, every crack in the underbrush, every shift in the wind. It knew the dangers of the forest, the presence of predators, and the sudden threats that might arise at any moment. But the baby, so fragile and dependent, had become its sole focus. The dog's protective instincts were at their peak, and it would defend this helpless child against anything that threatened it. But the world outside the dog's vigilance was not standing still. Somewhere far from the clearing, a group of hikers had made their way through the rugged terrain, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed foliage that led them deeper into the wilderness. These were no ordinary hikers. They were members of a search party, part of a team tasked with finding a missing child. A child who had disappeared after a horrific car crash on a remote stretch of road. The search had been ongoing for hours, and though they had found nothing so far, their hope was beginning to wane. The air grew heavier as the search party advanced. There were 5 of them, each equipped with backpacks, walkie-talkies, and the determination of people who had not yet given up. Their voices were a low hum among the trees, the sound of concern and urgency rippling through the forest like the wind that seemed to whip through the leaves. "There's no sign of the car wreckage," one of the men said, his voice low and tense. "We've been out here for hours. How can there be no trace?" "We'll keep going," a woman responded, her tone firm but tinged with worry. "The baby can't have gotten far. We'll find something. We have to." The group pushed on, cutting through the thick underbrush with machetes, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the child. Their hearts were heavy, the thought of a helpless infant alone in the wilderness gnawing at them. But as they moved deeper into the forest, something began to shift in the atmosphere. The path ahead seemed clearer. There were signs of movement, something odd in the way the forest was disturbed. "I think we're getting closer," one of the men said, stopping in his tracks. He knelt down, brushing his fingers across the ground. "There's fresh paw prints here, big ones." The others paused, their gazes following the trail that led off the path, deep into the trees. They looked at each other with uncertainty, but there was no time to second-guess their decisions. They followed the tracks, their steps quickening, the forest around them seeming to close in with every passing moment. The tension in the air thickened, and the silence of the woods grew oppressive. Meanwhile, the dog, though it was aware of the humans approaching, remained still. Its sharp ears caught the faint sounds of footsteps, the soft hum of human voices. It tensed for a moment, every muscle in its body coiled with readiness. But instead of attacking or retreating, the dog did something surprising. It remained calm. The protective instincts that had guided it through the night seemed to give way to an almost uncanny awareness. The humans were approaching, but the baby was not yet in danger. It was simply waiting. As the search party drew closer, their hearts pounding in their chests, the leader of the group, an older man with silver hair and a weary expression, raised his hand to signal a halt. "I can smell something," he muttered under his breath. "It's close." The group stood frozen for a moment, their breath held in the stillness of the forest. And then, as if on cue, the dog slowly rose from its spot beside the baby, its massive body shifting with fluid grace. It took a few steps backward, its eyes never leaving the humans, but its movements were not threatening. Instead, they were almost respectful. The baby, now partially awake, let out a soft cry, and the dog immediately shifted its attention back to the child, its massive frame hovering protectively over the infant. The humans, in turn, froze at the sight, a wild dog standing guard over the child. For a moment, no one moved. The scene was like something out of a dream, a perfect harmony between predator and prey, between the wild and the vulnerable. The leader of the group took a cautious step forward, his voice barely a whisper. Is that the baby?" His eyes were wide with disbelief. The sight before him was nothing short of extraordinary. The dog's gaze was intense, almost human in its understanding, but there was no aggression. It was clear now. The dog had not harmed the child. Instead, it had been protecting it. The group exchanged stunned glances. A mixture of fear and awe filled the air as they took another tentative step forward. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s, reached for her radio, but she hesitated, unsure of what to do. They had never trained for this kind of situation. How could they? A wild dog, nurturing a human infant? The dog growled softly, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air. It was not an angry growl, but a warning, a reminder that this was its charge, its responsibility. The hikers paused again, now more cautious than ever. The dog was no longer just an animal. It had become a protector, a guardian. And its message was clear. The baby was not to be touched unless it allowed it. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, as if sensing the change in the air, the dog shifted again. This time, its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it had made a decision. The dog moved aside, just enough to give the search party room to approach the child. Its eyes never left them, but it allowed them access. The woman in the group stepped forward, her heart in her throat. The dog's eyes followed her every movement, but it did not make a sound. The woman knelt next to the baby, her hands shaking as she reached out to lift the child. The baby, still weak but alive, looked up at her with wide eyes, as if it recognized that help had finally come. The moment the baby was in her arms, the dog growled again, a low rumble that sent a chill through the woman's spine. But instead of stopping her, the dog simply watched. Its gaze was full of understanding, perhaps even gratitude, that the baby would be returned to safety. It had done what it could, and now it would let the humans finish the job. The group stood in awe, gazing at the dog as they slowly backed away. Their hands were trembling, and their minds struggled to comprehend what had just transpired. But one thing was certain. They had witnessed a miracle. A wild animal, known for its ferocity, had protected a helpless human infant, demonstrating an unexpected and powerful act of compassion. And as they carried the child away, the dog turned and disappeared into the forest, its figure dissolving into the shadows as though it had never been there. The forest was silent once more, as if it too was reflecting on the incredible bond it had just witnessed between predator and prey, between nature and humanity. The search party moved cautiously through the forest, their steps growing heavier with the weight of the moment. The baby was in the arms of one of the hikers, wrapped tightly in a blanket, its tiny body still fragile from its ordeal. The hike back to civilization felt like an eternity, each minute dragging on as they traversed the dense woods. They could still hear the faint rustle of the trees, but the dog, its watchful eyes and towering presence, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving only a lingering sense of awe and mystery behind. Yet, even as the group made their way towards safety, something gnawed at their minds. There was an unspoken feeling between them that the dog had made an incredible sacrifice. Not only had it protected the baby against the wilderness, but it had also made an extraordinary decision to allow them, humans, to take the child away. The dog had been a mother in its own right, and it had entrusted the baby's future to them. But why? The leader of the group, an older man named David, was struggling with the enormity of what they had just witnessed. He was no stranger to the wild. He had spent years as a forest ranger, tracking animals, rescuing hikers, and dealing with the dangers of nature. But this was different. This was something beyond the usual boundaries of human understanding. The dog had not attacked them. It had not even tried to defend its claim over the baby. Instead, it had stepped back, almost as if it knew that its purpose in this moment had been fulfilled. "Do you think it knew something?" the woman who had been holding the radio earlier asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they continued their trek. "That the baby had to go back to people?" David shook his head, unsure of how to answer. He had never been one to assign human-like emotions to animals, but what he had seen that day left him questioning everything. The dog's actions had been deliberate, almost as if it had made a conscious decision to let the child go. "The dog understood," David finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "It wasn't just protecting the baby, it was letting go. It knew that the child's journey didn't end with it." As they emerged from the trees into the clearing near the search base, the reality of what they had just experienced began to settle in. The baby, though weak, was alive, and it was going to make it. But the question remained, why had the dog made the decision to allow the baby's return to civilization? Why had it not fought to keep the child, as one might expect from an animal in the wild? As they reached the search party's camp, a sense of relief washed over them. Medical personnel were ready to take the baby, and there was a flurry of activity as the child was placed into the care of professionals. But even as the baby was whisked away to safety, the group could not shake the feeling of the dog's presence, lingering like an unanswered question in the back of their minds. Hours later, the camp was buzzing with the news. The media had arrived, and the story was beginning to spread, first locally, then nationally. The images of the dog, standing protectively over the baby, were captured in photographs that would go viral in the coming days. Experts were consulted, and they speculated on the dog's behavior, but no one could offer a definitive explanation for its actions. It was simply a mystery, a story that would captivate the world's imagination. Meanwhile, back in the forest, the dog watched from a distance. It stood at the edge of the trees, its gaze fixed on the camp in the distance, where the humans had taken the child. It had made its decision. It had given the baby what it needed, a chance at life. And now it would return to its own life, its own world. The forest, its home, was where it belonged. But in that moment, as it stood there, watching the camp fade into the distance, the dog's actions took on a new meaning. It wasn't simply a mother protecting its young. It wasn't just an animal following instincts. There had been something deeper, something almost human-like, in the way it had made the choice to let go. The dog did not move toward the humans. It did not attempt to find the baby again. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, the dense forest swallowing it whole. Its powerful body melted into the landscape, as though it had never existed at all. The only sign that it had been there was the faint imprint of its massive paw prints on the soft earth. And yet, in the hearts of the hikers, the search party, and the medical team that had rushed to the baby's aid, something profound had been set in motion. They had seen an act of kindness that defied the natural order of things. An animal, usually known for its ferocity, had shown compassion, and in doing so, had taught them something invaluable. The dog's shocking decision to allow the child's return was not just an act of protection. It was an act of understanding. An understanding that sometimes, even in the wildest, most dangerous parts of the world, compassion can exist where we least expect it. And in the silence of the forest, where life and death dance on the edge of each moment, the dog's decision would echo long after it had vanished from sight. For those who had witnessed it, there would be no forgetting the bond they had witnessed between a human child and an animal. A bond forged not in violence, but in an extraordinary act of love and sacrifice. The baby's safe return to civilization sparked a media frenzy, with news outlets covering the miraculous rescue from every angle. People around the world were captivated by the heart-wrenching story of the infant found in the wild, saved not by human hands, but by an unexpected and selfless act of compassion from one of nature's most formidable creatures. In the days that followed, the images of the dog, standing protectively over the baby, and then quietly stepping away as the child was taken, would be replayed time and time again, each time stirring a deep sense of awe and wonder. The baby, now safe and surrounded by medical care, was quickly placed into the care of its family, who had been frantically searching for it since the accident. The emotional reunion, marked by tears of joy and disbelief, was broadcast for the world to see. But as the media cameras captured the warmth and relief of the baby's return, something more profound was at play in the background. The dog had done its part, not just as a protector, but as a silent guardian who, despite the odds, had made the ultimate decision to let go. And what of the dog? In the quiet stillness of the forest, it watched as the humans carried the child away, its massive frame barely visible in the shadows. There was no triumphant roar, no sign of conquest. The dog had completed its mission, its instinct to protect and nurture having guided it to make the ultimate sacrifice, allowing the baby to go back to the world it belonged to. The mystery of the dog's actions lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Experts speculated that the dog may have seen something in the baby, a kindred spirit, a defenseless life in need of protection. And in that moment, the wildness of nature gave way to something deeper, an understanding of compassion. It was as if the dog had known that its role had been to preserve life, not take it, and in doing so, it had defied all expectations. The story of the dog and the baby would live on, not only as a tale of survival but as a reminder that compassion knows no bounds. In a world that often feels cold and indifferent, where human nature can sometimes seem disconnected from the world around us, this story of the dog's kindness served as a powerful reminder that love and sacrifice can emerge in the most unexpected of places. As the forest reclaimed its silence and the media buzzed with the baby's return, the world was left with one lingering thought. Perhaps the most extraordinary acts of kindness happen not from humans to animals, but from animals to humans. The mystery of the dog's selfless act would continue to inspire countless hearts, sparking questions that transcended the boundaries of species and taught us all a lesson in what it truly means to care. As you reflect on the incredible story of the dog and the baby, remember that kindness exists in the most unlikely forms, and sometimes, animals show us more humanity than we ever expected. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe in the power of compassion, even in the wildest corners of the earth? Let us know your thoughts. Stay tuned for more incredible stories of unexpected acts of kindness, wild rescues, and the miraculous bonds that connect us all human and animal alike. Don't miss our next video, where we bring you even more heart-stopping, emotional stories from the animal kingdom.